Sudaroli. I'm from Prajnya. I'm happy to welcome all of you to Prajnya Colloquium, Equality Colloquium series. This is the third lecture of the series. And I'm also happy to welcome Dr. Malarvizhi Jayanth. She's going to talk about the hatred of women in practices of caste and compulsory heterosexuality. So the lecture has two components. The first 45 minutes, she's going to talk about the, she's going to talk. And then the another 45 minutes will be the discussion. And I encourage all of you to enter your comments and questions in the chat box so that it will be easier for the speaker to pick up and discuss about whatever the question is asked. The Prajnya Equality Colloquium series is the series of the 4 lectures. We are really feel very privileged to compile the 4 lectures on caste and gender every year in the month of April, that is the birth month of Dr. Ambedkar. And we hope to to continue this every year. These lectures, out of the 4 lectures, 2 will be in English and 2 will be in Tamil. So I'm also more privileged to introduce our speaker, Dr. Malarvizhi Jayanth. Actually, when we asked bio, she has sent only 2 lines about her. But I'm also honored to, I honor her saying she's, we are honored, she is a volunteer of Prajnya and part of our oral history project as well. So Dr. Malarvizhi Jayanth is currently pursuing postdoctoral research in agrarian slavery in southern colonial India at the University of Cambridge. She holds a PhD in South Asian Studies in the University of Chicago. She has earlier worked in journalism and publishing in Chennai. Over to you, Dr. Malarvizhi Jayanth.
Thank you for that introduction, Sudhir. I'll start my talk. Dr. Ambedkar has shown that since women were subject to various religious, social, and economic injunctions that men were not subject to, the rules governing their participation in caste society were more cruel, citing social practices like sati and forced widowhood and girl marriage in colonial India. Queer feminists have likewise grappled with how hatred of women structures women's unequal participation in heterosexual relationships across many cultures. Both compulsory heterosexuality and caste turn women into property. As a consequence, women can be given away, exchanged, assaulted, coerced into providing sex and labor, and kept under guard, all in the name of protecting various kinds of honor. So theories of caste and queer feminism converge on the question of gendered violence, showing that the institutions of both heterosexuality and caste are formed and sustained by violence against women. Through a close reading of Ambedkar's writings on caste and gender, and of recent queer feminist writing with a focus on Jane Ward's book titled The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, I propose to describe the nature of this convergence. I will show that the exploitation of women and the atrocities unleashed upon Dalits are not exceptional but mundane in these systems. They reveal the logic of caste and compulsory heterosexuality to be a routine violence rather than an occasional excess. I will examine the proposed solutions for this violence, including Ambedkar's suggestion of intermarriage between castes and Ward's argument for deep heterosexuality, where, as she puts it, heterosexual men like women so much they actually like them. I should confess here that Ward's book is the spark for this talk. Reading it during February, which is Queer History Month here in the UK, it was a catalyst for my thinking about misogyny as the link between practices of caste and compulsory heterosexuality. So the central problem of my talk today is the paradox of misogyny. Misogyny means the hatred of women. When this hatred structures caste relations, it means that the people tasked with maintaining the purity of a caste group are also treated as less important than men. When this hatred is harbored by heterosexual men, this means that men are sexually attracted to people they hate. This paradox of misogyny is laid bare both in anti-caste and in queer critique of social relations. Anti-caste critique has a long history, but to take one example from the 19th century, Jyotiba Phule, along with his wife Savitribai Phule, who were forerunners of the modern anti-caste movement, ran a school for Brahmin widows, besides publishing trenchant anti-caste writings. This practical criticism of gendered caste practice was a thread that ran through some later critiques of caste, most notably by Ambedkar and Periyar. The queer critique of heterosexuality is decidedly more recent, though there is mention of queer relationships in older literature. By queer, I mean the broad umbrella term included in the LGBTQIA acronym. L is for lesbians or women who love women, G for gay, meaning men who love men, B for bisexual or people who are attracted to genders similar to and different from their own, T for transgender or people who differ from the gender assigned at birth, and Q, which is, as I mentioned, queer, which is a broad term that encompasses these identities. Once used as a slur against sexual minorities, it has now been reclaimed as a term that people mobilize under. I is for intersex or people who have ambiguous genitalia, and A is for asexual or people who do not feel sexual desire. This LGBTQIA acronym is sometimes expanded to include the Hijra and the Koti identities, to include people who might be called trans or effeminate gay men in Western classifications. Together, these groups form the sexual minorities whose presence and alternative ways of making family powerfully question given notions of gender and coupledom. Despite queer people existing across many societies and time periods, they are treated as aberrations from the imagined norm, which is being straight or heterosexual. The critique of violence against women I want to show is the uniting feature across these challenges to practices of caste and compulsory heterosexuality. And by compulsory heterosexuality, I mean the celebration and reinforcement of straight or heterosexual relations as the only possible form of romantic love. This means that the anti-caste and queer critique are constantly struggling against the norm, against belief systems and practices that are widely understood as normal. Retrieving their histories is therefore a struggle against the historical erasure produced by dominant understandings of history. Now, the etymology of lesbian, the word for women who love women, is important here. The name derives from the Greek island of Lesbos, from where the acclaimed ancient poet Sappho is believed to have sung of desire for women. Only fragments of her work and mentions of her acclaim survive, so we know very little about her life and do not know the full extent of the poetry she produced. The very name for women who love women then is based on an absence, an erasure of the true extent of Sappho's work. This is symbolic of the erasures that structure the experience, lives, and histories of sexual minorities. The anti-caste project, likewise, is constantly grappling with the erasure of Dalit lives and histories. The role of Dalit India's most significant leader, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, in the creation of the Indian Constitution, for instance, has only recently begun to receive scholarly attention, though he is widely celebrated as the architect of the text. The erasure of Sappho and Sapphic ways of life then echoes the erasure of Dalit history and anti-caste ways of life. I want to emphasize that this is not a passive or accidental erasure. It is an erasure produced by actively treating elite caste and male histories and voices as more important. The normally unspoken problem of hatred towards women, particularly those that belong to lower caste groups or sexual or religious minorities, marks both these erasures. This hatred, likewise, is not a passive hatred, but an active expression of hostility that in its more benign forms presents as an inability to include women or lower caste groups in the conversation, and in its more vicious forms presents as rape and murder. This hatred also presents more viciously depending on the caste or the sexuality of the women it is directed towards, rendering Dalit women and sexual minorities at particular risk of violence. These acts of violence then exist on a spectrum of means of denying women's humanity, a spectrum that becomes visible when we question dominant social structures. Since both caste and gender are often justified as a division of labor, it might be necessary to make it clear at the outset that there is nothing natural about particular jobs being assigned to particular caste, just as there is nothing natural that requires that women be tasked with housework and childcare. This division is itself an expression of casteism, which, like racism, normalizes inequalities and male supremacist thinking. Ambedkar took the time to refute the argument that caste is a division of labor in his seminal work titled Annihilation of Caste. This text, which is highly recommended reading, I find fresh insights and food for thought each time I read it. This text was the speech that was intended for an audience of reformist Hindus, but was never delivered because the organizers of the conference decided Ambedkar's speech was too radical for their audience. Ambedkar has argued in it that caste can only be dissolved by intermarriage. He goes on to say that though this has been rightly identified by others as the means of undoing caste, it could not become a widespread practice unless a notional change had occurred. To do that, he argued for rejecting the Shastras because all other attempts at reform have failed, and because the sanctity behind caste and varna had to be destroyed. He then went on to declare his intent to leave Hinduism. This critique of Hinduism is echoed by activist G. Iman Semmalar, who argues against using mythology to affirm trans identities. As you might know, some Tamil trans women sometimes call themselves Aravani, drawing on the story of Aravan in the Mahabharata. Relying on myths to affirm our identities, Semmalar writes, gives rise to a regressive kind of trans identity politics that does not take into account the brutality of the caste system that finds its origin and sanction in the same religion. The sanction that religion provided for caste is the primary focus of Ambedkar's critique and annihilation of caste. In this text, he presents the famous formulation that caste was not a division of labor, but a division of laborers, and that caste was the monster, monster that killed all public spirit and fraternal thinking. By dividing people into a graded hierarchy where groups held more power and respectability than the ones below them, caste, he argued, made it impossible to form a cohesive nation. Gender, likewise, is often justified as a natural difference that is demarcated by the division of labor, particularly with regard to housework and childcare across many parts of the world. Any transgressions of gender norms, especially by queer people, are policed violently. Lesbian women can be subject to corrective rape, as in they can be subject to violence that is believed to cure them of their same-sex desire. Trans people of color in the West bear the brunt of queerphobic violence. Just as lower caste people, particularly Dalit groups, were either forced into poverty or denied the right to own property by casteism, women and sexual minorities are often paid less than men and are less likely to own property. So arguments for division of labor and the lived experience of dispossession make caste similar to gender ideologically. It has therefore been the case that several anti-caste interventions have been feminist in character. Misogyny is rendered tangible by anti-caste and queer critique. So I propose to spend some time with this question: what makes misogyny vivid to the queer and anti-caste eye? In other words, why does the hatred of women show up more clearly and more intolerably to people critical of caste and compulsory heterosexuality? I'll start by considering Ambedkar's discussion of the role of what he called the surplus man or the surplus woman, or people who have lost their spouse, within the caste system. After arguing that endogamy or marrying only within caste is the key to the mystery of the caste system, Ambedkar writes, and I quote, "From time immemorial, man as compared to woman has had the upper hand. He is a dominant figure in every group, and of the two sexes has greater prestige. With this traditional superiority of man over woman, his wishes have always been consulted. Woman, on the other hand, has been an easy prey to all kinds of iniquitous injunctions, religious, social, or economic. But man, as a maker of injunctions, is most often above them all. Such being the case, you cannot accord the same kind of treatment to a surplus man as you can to a surplus woman in a caste." As a reminder, he's referring to people who have lost their spouse when he says surplus. Sati, enforced widowhood, and girl marriage are customs that are primarily intended to solve the problem of the surplus man and surplus woman and to maintain its endogamy. endogamy again is marrying within caste exclusively. This quote demarcates both gender and caste as quite literally man-made structures produced and managed by men. The potential difficulties in maintaining caste endogamy can be managed by burning widows, marrying off children, or enforcing widowhood on women while allowing men to remarry. The practice of caste itself, as Ambedkar shows here, is dependent on the subservient and lower role of women. Endogamy can only be maintained by dramatically curtailing women's freedoms, and depending on the caste and class location of the women concerned, it can mean reduced freedom to work, denying them the right to marry people of their choice, or denying the right to remarry in the event of divorce or widowhood. Such refusal of autonomy to women is also a form of misogyny. Infantilizing women and refusing women the right to choose their partners is therefore also an expression of hatred towards women. As Ponni Arasu and Priya Tangaraja have shown, this belief that women cannot choose their partners is taken to its logical conclusion in the filing of kidnapping and abduction cases by South Asian parents against lesbian and queer couples with varying degrees of success. While one judge ruled that consenting adults were free to live together, another charged the couple with perjury for concealing the identity of the transgendered member. This infantilizing of women or denying them autonomy ensures that marriage within caste is always a marriage between unequals, between a superior man who has more freedom to act upon the world and an inferior woman who must look to him for leadership and support. This state of affairs is not peculiar to caste society, unfortunately, as feminists, both queer and otherwise, have demonstrated. Heterosexual marriage was and continues to be a relation between unequals across many parts of the world. As Jane Ward has shown in The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, that's the title of her book, since there has been no attempt to ameliorate the traumatic legacy of the hatred of women in the history of heterosexual marriage, contemporary attempts at moving past the notion of women as male property to women as romantic partners remains fraught with tension. Ward's book is also highly recommended reading because it demonstrates that heterosexuality is maintained by force and propaganda. In other words, that there is nothing natural about it, and that the transition from woman as dominated object to woman as partner and companion is incomplete and requires much work. Ward questions the rhetoric of queer suffering. Those of us familiar with queer cinema in particular will be aware of the often tragic outcomes of lesbian love stories. Ward questions this notion of queer suffering. On the one hand, it does not account for queer joy, family, or solidarity. On the other, it implies that heterosexuality is free of suffering. She picks apart the implication that heterosexuality is free of suffering, particularly for women. She goes on to argue that the forces of cultural propaganda and coercive physical violence are integral to sustaining heterosexuality. This ongoing work of maintaining heterosexuality as normal, as the only way to live, is called heteronormativity, that this way of life is normal and all others are not. With some thought, it becomes clear how this relates to caste as well. Through the mesh of social relations we are born into, through segregated neighborhoods, through ritual and food habits, caste is rendered natural and normal as the only way to live and as a source of pride and identity. As Sarah Ahmed has written, heterosexuality becomes the space within which the child is at home. Jane Ward, a lesbian feminist, wonders if children attuned to the misery wrought by the heteropatriarchy in the lives of parents and other significant adults, then swerve to avoid it by choosing queerness or alternative ways of making family. So I'll proceed to summarize Ward's book on the work of heteronormativity here, making some brief detours into comparisons with caste as the comparative case I'm most interested in. Ward begins by arguing that institutions and media images link basic human happiness and nearly all significant rites of passage to heterosexual desire and coupling. To quote from a later section in her book, heteronormative rituals shape how we understand the difference between youth and adulthood, success and failure, loneliness and connection. She suggests that the premise that heterosexuality is easier than queerness requires investigation. While it is true that heteronormativity produces queer suffering, This narrative masks the joy and community of being queer, including the relief at not being straight. Heterosexuality is maintained by force, particularly over women, both through propaganda and by assault, compulsory marriage, economic dependence, control of children, and domestic violence. She argues for holding the relationship between misogyny and heterosexuality in full view, to see beyond the male-centric claim that queerness constitutes a tragic and unwilled loss of power. So she chooses to recenter lesbian feminist ideas, and instead of focusing on queer misery, chooses to name the miseries of straight culture, particularly the countless daily injustices endured by straight women. The notion that being queer is tragic, she says, bolsters heteronormativity by implying that heterosexual lives are free of gendered violence and suffering. She acknowledges that violence against queer people motivated by the hatred of queerness does exist. However, heterosexuality can be worse, particularly for women, as lesbian feminists have written. And she she sort of summarizes what they say. With righteous rage, they have detailed the ways that straight men desired women's services, emotional, sexual, reproductive, domestic, rather than actual women, and they expose the toll this took on women's mental health. Ward notes that they were writing in the mid-1970s when marital rape was legal in every US state, and they therefore understood rape as an act of patriarchy and as a normalized expression of heterosexuality. We can think here of the Indian example where courts have sort of flip-flopped on acknowledging marital rape. The normalization of rape within marriage is an open acknowledgement of the fact that women are consistently denied autonomy or the ownership of their own bodies within heterosexual marriage. This serves to normalize violence as part of the heterosexual relationship. This does not, however, prevent women from being seduced into heterosexuality, an institution that, as these feminists have shown, benefited men and harmed women. Feminist historians have argued, Ward writes, that the exchange of potential love and protection for servitude is, historically speaking, heterosexual romance's defining moment. She discusses the extreme gender segregation that marks straight relationships and the absence of shared interests in such partnerships. She ponders the lack of sexual attraction to men among many straight identified women and the reasons they chose to be in relationships with men, which can include security, obligation, or desire for children. Heteromasculinity, meanwhile, is characterized by a much weaker and more conditional desire for women's bodies than is often claimed, she writes. To lesbian women, men's countless missed opportunities to actually like women are baffling. And yet she finds this unequal gender binary comes with romantic and erotic attachments. To repair the problems of this paradox, where romance is associated with violence, come bestsellers, and these are the names of some of the best-selling self-help books that she discusses. He's Just Not That Into You is one title. Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them is another. How to Date Men When You Hate Men is a title of a self-help book, all written explicitly to address the paradox of misogyny in heterosexual relationships. The misogyny paradox means that the male desire for women is expressed within a culture that also encourages them to hate women. We can think of the men who hurl compliments at women on the street, for example, quickly shifting into insults when the attention is not returned. Men are said to love women's bodies, but they lay a lot of conditions on how that body is presented. So they might insist, for instance, that they be waxed, dieted, or perfumed or starved into thinness. And this paradox takes a violent turn when men rape or murder the women they claim to have loved. Not only do men say they love women and then express their misogyny in these cases, this love-hate relationship is marketed to straight people as a source of happiness and as a natural relationship. Though straightness is understood as a natural desire for the opposite sex, Ward shows that it is historically formed. Through history, heterosexuality has been structured by male ownership of women and their bodies, their work, and their children. And liking women was not required. This notion of mutual likability is new. In Ward's words, this transition from woman as degraded subordinate to woman as worthy of deep love was hardly smooth, nor is it complete. Citing a book on heterosexuality in Iran by the author Najma Badi, she writes that the book drew her attention to 2 points. Modern notions of heterosexuality require men to feel love and affection for women, the very population they have dominated and dehumanized for centuries. And the second point, has caused many problems for straight people who are struggling to transition from the trauma and legacy of the hatred of women to something more authentically straight, if by straightness we mean authentic and non-coercive heterosexual love. As she writes later, the conditions of patriarchy have long damaged men's desire for women and women's for men, such that heterosexuality as a sexual orientation was always already a contradiction. Women were too inferior, too degraded for men to actually like. Women could be sexually desired and they could be paternalistically loved, but they could not be engaged as autonomous, self-determining humans in the way that men related to other men. It is to address this gap that emerges what she calls the modern heterosexual repair industry. As she puts it, the popular response to the heterosexual tragedy is to normalize it, and the message that men and women do not like each other was spread by, among other books, the best-selling title Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus by John Gray. This book, as the title indicates, presents 2 halves of the same species as being from entirely different planets. As my friend Adavan reminded me, this argument resonates with the work of Bell Hooks, who notes the different ways in which male-authored self-help and romantic fiction is received in comparison to women's writing. And Hooks writes specifically about rereading this book by John Gray, although she found it extremely problematic. Ward notes the project of husband maintenance, wherein women did the majority of housework, and emotional and organizational labor, was also normalized in a best-selling book on the 5 love languages. Ward quotes a plethora of recent self-help writing that pleads with women to let men feel superior. Literature that was, in her words, written as if centuries of patriarchy had never occurred, with women's submission to men presented as a hot new idea. She traces this contemporary body of writing from the early 20th century self-help literature, which is geared towards managing women's personalities and not just their bodies to produce happy heterosexual relationships. This points to what she calls the cyclical nature of the tragedy of heterosexuality. The same binary and misogyny that produce heterosexual misery are offered as the solution. As she puts it, an enduring feature of the tragedy of heterosexuality is straight men's sense of entitlement to women's sexual and emotional service. This sense of entitlement leads to straight culture's emergence as the romantic arm of misogyny, wherein the delicate coexistence of hate and love, the slap and the kiss, would come to represent the heteroerotic. Here we can think of all the ways in which violence against and harassment of women is produced as romantic in Indian cinema. Indian movie heroes have long been given the freedom to stalk and harass and bully women, all in the name of romantic love. From the queer perspective, then, the entire Indian film industry can be seen as a giant propaganda machine intended to whitewash heterosexuality, to make it desirable, normal, the sole option for love and joy. In this view, which is critical of heteronormativity, such propaganda is necessary to render heterosexuality attractive in a country where it is dangerous to be a woman, in a world filled with intimate partner violence. This danger, again, is produced as natural in cinema. Think of the Tamil film songs that constantly produce the attraction between men and women as completely natural and unstoppable attraction of opposites, using metaphors like water and fire or earth and sky. To return to Ward, she cites a group called the radical lesbians who argue that the heterosexual structure binds women in one-on-one relationships with their oppressors, leading to the pouring of much energy into fixing each of these relationships. Yet, despite all this work necessary to repair and uphold heterosexual relationships, such relationships are consistently produced as normal and necessary. Queerness, as Ward puts it, emerges as an affront to the celebrations of heteroromantic hardship. In other words, choosing to exit compulsory heterosexuality for for other sexualities and ways of making family is treated as a threat to the norm which is struggling to justify itself. It is a consequence of rendering heterosexuality the norm as the only way to express love that straight people do not need to justify or explain their sexuality to others or to themselves, whereas queer people often have to produce these explanations. Heterosexuality appears, she writes, to be a hard sell, a campaign in need of propaganda, and in some instances, like in the American example, a white supremacist project. And it's worth keeping in mind here that some people have argued that caste is a form of eugenics, of maintaining racial purity, an argument that Ambedkar rips apart in Annihilation of Caste. He argues against the biological defense of caste as eugenics or as preserving the purity of blood, arguing that it is instead a social division of people of the same race. The concept of eugenics has been mobilized in favor of the heterosexual project as well. Ward shows how the forces of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy often overlapped. Early attempts at heterosexual repair in the USA were explicitly eugenicist, promoting happy marriages as a means of enabling the flourishing of white people. Yet this was an uphill battle, she writes, since men and women were repulsed by each other, and the self-help literature of the time acknowledged that the male desire to cause women pain was a problem. These authors further acknowledge that rape and trauma were many women's introduction to marriage. Since, she writes, in straight culture, a vagina is evaluated according to its capacity to please men and not its capacity to experience pleasure, men had to be taught how to pleasure women, whereas the pleasure of men was centered in most understandings of sex. Indeed, as Ponniarasan and Priya Thangaraja have argued, a significant complaint against lesbian relationships is that the sexual activity involved is entirely for women's pleasure with no other purpose. So despite all these complications produced by the paradox of misogyny in straight relationships, Ward remains hopeful. To cite her words again, straight men could be so unstoppably heterosexual that they crave hearing women's voices, thirst for women's leadership, ache to know women's full humanity, and thrill at women's freedom. This is how lesbian feminists lust for women. I do not despair about the tragedy of heterosexuality because another way is possible. End quote. Here I want to emphasize that her understanding of the problem of misogyny and therefore this talk is only made possible through the queer perspective. Straightness or heterosexuality is so overwhelmingly rendered the norm that, Ward argues, it cannot even be named outside of queer spaces. Here, to think within the Indian example again, the question of gay sex was briefly thrust upon the national consciousness when Section 377 was challenged in court, struck down, reinstated, and struck down again. This section of the law, which criminalized gay sex, has been among the few examples that I can think of when queer relationships found space in mainstream media, when discussions of this law came to mainstream media. Decriminalization of gay sex remains the most significant landmark in modern Indian queer history. While there have been progressive judgments allowing queer couples to cohabit or denying the medical establishment the right to forcefully assign a gender to intersex people, it remains doubtful if we will see further progressive legislation permitting queer marriage in our lifetimes. Such legislation has been introduced in various parts of the world, but remains fiercely contested by several groups drawn from religious and civil society. The rights of the transgendered, for example, are periodically debated and turned into fodder for what is called the culture wars here in the UK. We have made some very small advances with regard to trans rights in India. The option to choose a third option outside the binary is sometimes available to trans people, though they are not always permitted to identify as men or women. The employment opportunities available for trans women remain severely curtailed, which is why I think it's so important that we have Grace Banu, I think the next speaker on this series, talking about the need for reservations for trans people. All of this is to say that the queer critique of straightness is almost unnameable and easily dismissed. If expression of gay love through sex is rendered a crime, if lesbian relationships are erased by the impossibility of even thinking about them in the law, If trans people have to constantly fight for the recognition of their humanity, then survival and the right to love people of our choosing remains the primary struggles of our lives. Concern for straight people or the travails of straight women might be hard to come by in such cases. Ward addresses this concern early in her book. She acknowledges that it might seem strange to be concerned about straight people when they formed a dominant majority, but insists that the critique of heterosexuality is rendered even more urgent by this dominance. To allow it to present as the sole source of joy is to erase the joys of queer solidarity. Since I've spent a lot of time now with Ward's arguments that speak primarily of an American history, I'd like to introduce at least one other book on queerness in India. This book is titled No Outlaws in the Gender Galaxy and has been compiled by Chayanika Shah, Raj Merchant, Shals Mahajan, and Navatya Smriti. Here I must thank D. Geeta for suggesting Chayanika Shah's work as relevant to the themes of this talk. Shah and her fellow author editors put together a questionnaire intended for people who were assigned to the female gender at birth, but have transgressed this assignment in some way, either by choosing alternative gender expressions, or by living as trans, or by engaging in lesbian relationships. The authors then compiled the various responses to put together a rich introduction to queer love, lives, and struggles in India. They find that the understanding of gender as a binary, where male and female are the only two forms of gender expression available, is imposed by the monitoring of gender expression, the moral policing of sexuality, and forced heterosexual marriages. This notion of the binary structures public spaces, whether restrooms, public transport, hospitals, malls, or airports. Members of medical and legal professions also profess their belief in this binary in various ways, leading to the violent policing of bodies that do not fit the norm. The authors further find that families and schools are spaces where the lifelong process of being punished for behaviors that do not fall within heteronormative boundaries are first encountered. Though there is trauma and violence, these narratives also have what the authors call affirmation and resolve of deep desires to be able to live lives the way they want to. Here I want to pause to acknowledge how independence or autonomy or the right to choose how to love or live is a powerful value across these queer critiques of heterosexuality. The authors further note that identifying as men for people assigned female at birth affects education and job prospects. They find that women's sports allowed some women non-normative dressing styles and relationships. While many struggle with finding and keeping jobs, caste or class privilege can help. Here it's worth remembering the concept of intersectionality drawn from Black feminist thought, which is a reminder that the identity of being a sexual minority is not the sole identity one might bear. The experience of being queer can be modulated by caste and class locations. To return to the book, the author-editors find that gender-segregated spaces, which can on occasion allow for non-normative relationships, also violently police transgressive bodies. Though many women face violence in public spaces, those who transgress gender norms face heightened scrutiny and violence. The authors further find that queer means of making family can also echo straight relationships in terms of division of housework or notions of marriage or violence. And class, caste, and gender expression structure these relationships too. So as the texts I have cited for the queer and anti-caste critique of gender and sexuality make abundantly clear, gender is not a binary but a hierarchy. The straight man is perched on top, and the various genders and sexualities that form the spectrum of human existence are placed in differing positions below him. The division of labor argument that men must do certain tasks and women others, or that lower caste groups were responsible for certain professions, reveals itself to be fundamentally hierarchical in this critique. Labor and wealth are not divided equitably across the caste and gender hierarchies. Just as men have historically eaten the outcome of women's work while denying their humanity, elite castes have consumed products of the labor of low caste groups while denying them physical and social contact, which is another form of dehumanization. These hierarchies are now being challenged through queer and anti-caste critique. The heteropatriarchy has to reconcile the inferiority of the woman with the new project of romantic love. Caste, meanwhile, requires the purity of women, the same woman who is a threat to its hierarchies, who can upset its smooth functioning by choosing partners from other castes. In my research on slavery in southern colonial India, for example, I've encountered cases of elite women being sold into slavery as punishment for the crime of having lower caste lovers. Both heterosexuality and caste then turn women into property. They can be given away, exchanged, assaulted, coerced into providing sex and labor, and kept under guard, as I mentioned earlier. The coercive nature of straight sex, as lesbian feminists have noted, made sure that it was unconcerned with female pleasure. This lack of concern for female pleasure in straight sex has been given the cover of reproduction, although such sex is only rarely intended to make babies. Both caste and the heteropatriarchy are invested in what theorists have called the scaffolding of rape, by unleashing sexual violence against women, even when such violence militates against the ideologies that produce them. The flimsy reasons produced to justify untouchability, for example, can be conveniently ignored in the sexual exploitation of lower caste women. Rape is, after all, the ultimate expression of a lack of concern for female pleasure or autonomy. It is an act of hateful violence and not an act of sex. Caste and compulsory heterosexuality further control the sexuality of women through the control of reproduction, through arranged marriage, and through honor killings. What Ward calls institutionally sanctioned misogyny, or the systemic hatred and suspicion of women, then, is a feature of the systems of heterosexuality and caste. It is not a bug to be fixed, but is formative of the structure itself. So thus far, I have focused on why misogyny is a problem for both anti-caste critique and the questioning of heteronormativity. For the concluding section of my talk, I want to look at how the hierarchies produced by caste and heterosexuality can be undone. As I hope I have made clear, the anti-caste and queer critique are a manner of reading which, to rephrase trans activist and author Sean Fay, requires the redefining of violence and structures of power, and encourage us to engage with how people are absorbed into such systems and become perpetrators of violence. Faye has argued in her book and elsewhere that the nature of violence, abuse, boundaries, consent are not taught in school or even discussed within families or elsewhere. And therefore, this is a form of critique that people arrive at in various ways outside the what one would assume are the normal channels of schooling or socializing. The cognition of one's subjugated status has taken various forms in anti-caste and queer critique. Ambedkar suggested intercaste marriage and the rejection of the text sanctioning caste-based discrimination as the only means of dissolving caste's hold on psyche and on social life. Yet in Tamil Nadu, we have seen too many instances of Dalit men being subject to murderous violence for the crime of choosing their partners. The problem of caste contempt does not go away even within some marriages that endure. Since we are putting anti-caste and queer critique in conversation here, it must be acknowledged that there has long been a strain of queer critique that is critical of marriage as a patriarchal institution. Whether this institution can become the source of anti-caste liberation remains to be seen. While critiques of marriage have traditionally included critique of male dominance, Ward offers an alternative in her notion of deep heterosexuality. In this version of heterodesire, men actively desire women's liberation rather than treat this freedom as a threat to their well-being. The work required to bring about this shift in thinking might well be immense and maybe take a few generations to come to fruition. For this reason, it might be useful, I think, to also daydream of utopia a little bit. Utopia is a word coined by the 16th century English writer Thomas More, playing on the Greek words that meant no place and good place, underlining the imaginary nature of this perfect space that he was producing, that contrasted with the less than perfect reality. So what is the utopia that queer and anti-caste critiques dream of? Here's what Amelia Abraham found after interviewing queer people across several European countries, North America, and Turkey. These desires linked to the various political projects she encountered, she writes. We wanted to be rid of shame and stigma. We wanted our rights enshrined in the law to protect us. and the freedom to express ourselves as we wish. And these are what she finds to be common threads across queer mobilizing across several countries. Most crucially, she suggests it is fighting for these things that makes us queer, rendering queerness an active choice rather than an immutable identity. The notion of queerness as something to work toward rather than achieve has, she notes, been present since the beginning of queer studies. To be anti-caste, likewise, remains a work in progress rather than an identity that is achieved. Through an interview with a queer family in Sweden, Abraham arrives at the epiphany that the many people she had interviewed were all building utopia in their own way, that just as queerness may well always be a work in progress, so too utopia, or the perfect imaginary society we strive towards. This I find a hopeful way of thinking about the transformations in gender and sexuality that queerness and anti-caste critique can produce. Utopia can be something we assemble piece by piece rather than wait for a long delayed revolution. So as a postscript, and in relation to the notion of utopia as something we can collectively put together, I want to conclude with the words of queer artist Lubena Himid. As a British artist of Tanzanian origin, Himid has broken barriers with her own art and has also worked to bring together fellow women artists through a collaborative exhibition that included Black lesbian artists among the people presenting. I have one picture of her work, which I'm not sure will be very clear, but here it is. As you can see, she's working with cutouts and collage. So she creates works that stand out, that are also marked with text in some cases. And this piece of work that I showed you is titled "We Will Be." And the text on it says, "We will be who we want, where we want, with whom we want, in the way that we want, when we want, and the time is now, and the place is here." It's worth re-emphasizing that this desire to choose one's lovers without being constrained by caste or compulsory heterosexuality is a guiding thread through the two forms of critique that I was discussing. So that concludes my speech. I hope you found it useful, interesting, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, this is a very wonderful, actually, the talk. Thank you for this. And, there is one comment, I think. I can just read it for you. Thank you for an amazing talk. In thinking about queer utopia, I'm also wondering if and how intersectionality can point a way that does not fall into the trap of valorizing an idea of queer progress based on caste, class, and other privileges and masculine mobility. So, yeah, this is Geeti Das.
Okay, let's see if I can find the question in the chat. Yes.
So anybody having questions, you can post here.
So thanks, Geeti Das, for that question. I think in terms of intersectionality, yes, It Gets Better campaign is something that I think Jane Ward addresses, I'm not sure. But people have said how it offers this sense of optimism and offers a sense that progress is possible. You just have to move to a bigger city or something like that. I think one way to work through this issue is to foreground voices from across the spectrum. So of trans people in particular, of trans women from underprivileged backgrounds in particular. And that is something that even I have failed to do in my talk, actually. There have been a few queer activists have drawn together, but it's not as diverse a lineup as I would like. So that's my initial response. I'll have to think some more about what else is possible, but I think my initial response is to say we have to foreground voices from across the spectrum. We have to find aspirations across the spectrum rather than say, not everybody is aspiring for marriage, for example. For some people, queerness affects the basic, their basic livelihoods itself. So yeah, that's my initial response, but thanks for the question. I'll have to think some more about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sandhya says, thank you for the amazing session. I can relate on many topics as mentioned in the narration. I'm curious to know your opinion on the new bill introduced in the parliament on legalization of same-sex marriages under Special Marriage Act few days back.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Sandhya. I don't know very much about the new bill except that it was introduced by, I believe, an independent. I'm not sure if that was a person associated with a political party. I'm not fully sure. You should correct me if I'm wrong. But it's definitely something to celebrate, a first step of some sort. But I remain pessimistic about how it will turn out. Yeah, so it was introduced by a private member. It would, I think, be much more powerful if it was introduced by a representative of a political party. And one of the reasons for my pessimism is a recent case that was brought up in Uttar Pradesh, I think, where a lesbian couple went to court arguing for the right to live together and suggested that other countries have introduced bills legalizing same-sex marriage. And so it was not an outlandish claim to make, but their case failed. So I'm not sure what the options are. I'm thinking of the American example where when interracial marriage was first legalized in the US, public support for interracial marriage had not yet crossed 50%. Whereas when some years ago, same-sex marriage was, queer marriage was legalized, public support for that had already crossed 50%. In other words, sometimes the courts drag us along, sometimes the court catches up in terms of how they understood public perception of what might be, to some people, controversial. So I don't know if we will either see a court that leads us there or whether we will cross 50% support for same-sex marriage, but we can start to build utopia in smaller ways, but I remain pessimistic about this private member's bill.
Okay, thank you, Malarvizhi. So anybody having any other questions?
I have a question, but should I go to the chat box? Can I ask it directly?
Yes,
sorry.
Please ask.
Yeah. So, still continuing on the topic of...
please introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Busaina, and also work in the space of mental health and all. So I was just wondering on the topic, continuing on the topic of same-sex marriages. This essentially is it's very heteronormative institution of marriage, right? So when you're talking about heteronormativity, and then how the queer community is adopting to these institutions, what is your stand on more different forms of civil unions in queer spaces rather than just adopting them?
My stance is a little complicated. If I'm in mixed or it's surrounded by primarily straight people, then I argue that queer people should be free to do whatever they want. And if that means getting married or joining the army, then they should be free to do it as themselves rather than pretending to be others. But within primarily queer audiences, I tend to ask more questions about whether marriage is the primary fight of queer equality, whether there are other ways to frame queer struggles. And what those other ways are, I'm still a little hazy. But I think that there are that things like alternative ways of making family have emerged in queer communities. And if we can find a way to celebrate and support those ways of making family as well, that I think would be my stance in, as I said, predominantly queer settings. So I take both sides of the debate, which might be a bit of a cop-out, but that's where I am right now.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Malar, I just wanted to, since I've known you from your previous work, I was sort of curious about, no, I'm not going to ask you about that, but just thinking about your journey as an oral historian also, as you've worked on newer questions, newer issues. I would just like to learn a bit more. Have you been able to use the same methods, and are you still doing oral history? And are people willing to talk about these issues in ways that will allow us to read and learn?
So when I met you, I think I was still grappling with that question of what the lived experience of caste looks like across the hierarchy. And that was one of the things I was trying to get at through my blog, which I'm not sure I was successful at, but it did provide an introduction to, as you said, the oral history method. But because of I think my interest in anti-caste history took me to the archive. The archive now has an inescapable pull on my attention. So I'm not sure if the earlier work, I think because of the blog, I have got a finer sense of how caste works in everyday life. And because of that, I read the archive differently, I think. So within colonial historians, for example, until recently, there was a consensus that colonial rule in some way froze caste relations, that it heightened those divisions. And I am a bit more skeptical of those claims because of my previous work. So that's in terms of how I approach the archive. Other than that, in interpersonal interactions, I've found that my anti-caste stance can sometimes clash with what people understood as their queerness. So for example, I encountered one person who was gay and Brahmin and critical of my anti-caste stance, who introduced me to his friends as some lower caste woman. And that was the words he used, some lower caste woman. So there are ways in which my stance has modulated my relationship to the predominantly elite caste diaspora I encountered in the US. So I feel like a lot of the discussions I've had post that blog have tended to be theoretical and hypothetical, less engaged with daily life as I had been trying to do. So I want to see if that changes somehow after having produced my archival research. That's still something I'm doing.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about, I mean, it's not like you leave that work behind, right? So I would be curious to continue to witness your journey and see how you maybe in some sense bring them together, reconcile, but also reconcile is the other part of the question in my head, the question that's being formulated, which is, I think that one of the problems with written and archival histories is how many categories of human experience they make invisible. Because you know, so in some sense, when you work with archives, it may be that much of what you are doing is still, you know, it's still not all that is out there. I know that everything in the archives hasn't been studied, but you know that there is still a huge part. So how you would bring the two together, or how you would, or like we try to do with our oral history programs, in a sense, to supplement the written record, the mail record of public life with other stories. I would just be curious to see how you deal with this in work that you're now doing and work that is to come. And I know it's a very incoherent question, but still.
No, it's helpful to think like that.
So listening to you, these are the things I'm thinking.
I'm not sure how far I can lean on oral history for the ongoing research that I'm doing, but I do want
These are
at
the
some
things
point
I'm
to
thinking.
either pick up research themes from a later period or to think of anti-caste history as a more interdisciplinary project. I'll still have to work that out. Right now, the work that I'm doing is heavily archival, but I do want to, at some point, include the other work that I have done in my thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question actually. Like generally in media, like in cinemas and medias, I mean in all the languages in Indian movies, like the homosexuals and the same-sex marriages, or like under they are not showing that in a way like the people degrading way kind of. So what do you think, like how we need to, because the people also will be looking at it down and things like that. So how do you want to like formulate it, or what is your opinion on this?
I agree that positive representation is one very, very important thing to remove stigma, but I'm not sure how we can. I've heard that there were 2 Hindi movies recently, one with Ayushmann Khurrana, I think, as the actor, and another, I forget what these movies were called though. And another one about a lavender marriage, as it's called, where a gay man and a lesbian woman marry in a marriage of convenience. I heard that these 2 movies came out recently, which might be a small first step towards positive representation. But I really can't think of any other reason for optimism or the hope that. So there are smaller projects like documentaries and small scale memoir type video projects that I've encountered that talk about being gay in India, but how we can shift the needle towards positive representation, I'm still not sure. Unless we have prominent public figures come out as gay, unless we have more writing and more news stories about queer people, which are not focused exclusively on identity, but on their full lives. Unless we have all this, I'm not sure what positive representation could look like right now. But I remain hopeful based on these 2 movies. Not sure when Tamil will see something similar.
Yeah. So, anybody having any questions to ask her?
Oh, someone has shared the name of the movie in the chat.
Oh, okay. Chantikar Kare Badai too, yeah. Yeah. So thank you, Malar, for being with us, and such a wonderful talk you gave us. And this is a photo time, so maybe we can take some picture together. So anybody, like everybody can switch on your camera if you want.
If you want to be in the picture.
Yes.
I want to be in the picture with Malar.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I just take the picture.
Busena? Shakti?
Not in a position to.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. But I'm happy to see you here.
Same. I'm happy that this is the part of this process. Really, like me.
Yeah. Thank you, Malar, for being with
Thank
us.
you, Sudhir. So
Yeah.
thanks to Prajnya and my hosts, Swarna, Sudhir, and Amrita. It was great to be able to talk about these themes, which have been running around in my head for a long time, but haven't found coherent shape yet. So it was great to be able to talk about this with you. Thank you.
I think it's safe to say that we've learned a lot from your talk that we will be thinking about as well. So thank you very much. I'll add mine to Sudhar's.
Okay.
Sudhar, you can officially close up.
Yeah. So next Friday on 29th, yeah. So 29th, we are having trans activist Grace Bonu talking about the reservation rights. I mean, the importance of reservation for the trans people. So yeah, please everybody register and attend. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.